As always, we want to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. You can always be in touch with us by email at hebrew@nbn.org.il. If you're joining us live on Zoom, you can write to us in the chat with any questions, comments, concerns, as well as topic requests. You can also see all of our previous lessons up on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com, type in Cafe Oleh. The first result will be a link to our playlist with nearly 200 past lessons. More than, I believe, we're up to 36,000 views. So you can not only leave us a comment and like our videos there, you can also watch them at your convenience anytime you want, completely free. And of course, subscribe to our list there. Finally, if you're joining us live on Zoom, we're currently at 200 participants and the numbers keep growing as I talk. So first off, Toda Rabba, thank you all so much for joining. You make us what we are, which is the world's largest regularly scheduled Hebrew class. That is no small feat, and that is all about you. So we kindly ask you, if you're joining us live on Zoom, that if you have any questions about the topic we're about to discuss, to please write it in the Q&A button on the Zoom menu and not in the chat. We'll review the chat transcript after class, but if you have questions for me during class, Q&A only, please. We also ask that you keep the chit chat in the chat, both adult at an adult level, and also to a minimum. And finally, if you are used to using Zoom with an AI bot, we kindly ask you to disable it while you're on Cafe Oleh Live. You're already getting a free Hebrew class, a free recording, and a free vocabulary spreadsheet. You don't need to be using a chat transcript. And at the top of the hour, in addition to answering your questions, I'll also be telling you about our Wednesday class and our upcoming schedule. In fact, before I get to class and apropos our schedule, so next week we are going to be taking the week off in between winter and spring sessions. What next week is also the Jewish holiday of Purim. So we're going to use that week both for celebrating, of course, and hope you do the same. We have a whole lesson up on our YouTube channel on Purim, how it's celebrated in Israel. So you're welcome to join us there and watch at your convenience. We're also going to be using that to get the word out on Cafe Olé. So we highly recommend you telling your family and friends to join us. We'll be starting in 2 weeks from today with our spring session with all sorts of new classes we've done in the past, totally new topics. So we're always eager to hear from you what topics you'd like to cover. Also in the spring, as we say in English, when we change the clocks, spring forward, we're going to be starting our classes at 7 p.m. Israel time, as opposed to 8 p.m. Israel time. Hopefully that will allow us to reach an even larger audience than we currently have. And we hope that will continue your participation wherever you are in the world to join us. If you can't join us live, you always know that there is the YouTube channel there. You can watch our videos at your convenience, but we will be starting to do classes at 7 p.m. Starting in our spring session. All of that is available when you sign up and register. If you haven't received the link yet, you should check your email. And of course, the Nefesh B'Nefesh website will have it for you. With that, let's get started. So today's class is a topic that was sent in by you, a request. We've actually done it before, and we're going to be doing it again later this year, and you'll understand why I say that. And we're going to do it a little bit more practically later on in the year once the date is more finalized. But today and in Wednesday's Cafe Olé conversation, we're going to be talking about politics, Israeli politics, but not getting into politics. What do I mean by that? The idea of this week is to give you the vocabulary to understand and talk about Israeli politics. Where you take that is up to you. This is not going to delve into personal political opinions. This is going to talk about the political system because it is different. And that's not just from necessarily, especially those of you coming from North America, and even especially those coming from other parliamentary democracies. Okay, so we're going to give you an overview of that, and Wednesday we're going to put it to the test in our conversation groups, which I'll talk about a little bit at the top of the hour, in addition to answering questions. So without further ado, let's go right into class. And obviously, if you have questions along the way, please write them in the Q&A, not in the chat. I will not be reading the chat until after Class is over. Let's get started. So, how do we say all these words in Hebrew? So first off, let's create some common vocabulary for ourselves before we get into the system of governance here in Israel and even how you say that. So first off, politics, politica. Is there another word for it? Of course. Do we use it? No. We say politica. Okay, politica means politics in Hebrew. That's referring to Israeli politics, American politics, anywhere in the world. Politica, politics. Okay. And a word that is related in the English, related to the same root, but in Hebrew it's different, and it's an important one. Um, uh, Here is mediniyut. Mediniyut is policy. In English, they sound very similar, politics and policy, and they are related, but they're different, obviously, in their applications. I'm not going to get into it too much here, but just as there's a difference in English between politics and policy, so too is there in Hebrew. We just make those terms very different. Mediniyut comes from the same word as Medina, state, right? So mediniyut, the affairs of the state, you can think of it as. And this is also important when you're watching the news, as we do here at Cafe Oleh, and we watch actual mainstream Israeli news and you listen to the reporters, because each of the reporters has a different beat, a different segment of Israeli society that they cover. And so many of the big media outlets will have a katav, which is the word for reporter, a katav politi, and a katav medini. The Katav Politi, right, is in charge of internal politics, meaning internal Israeli internal politics, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the Katav Medini is usually on the larger state level, usually foreign relations or larger issues affecting the government as a whole, whereas Politi usually has to deal with inter or intra political party affairs. Okay. And then we have two words. And you're going to see this a lot, by the way, in Hebrew, where we have two words that look almost exactly alike, but they have different applications. Such is the case of memshal and memshala. Memshal is governance. It's the general term we use to describe governance. Okay. And this has to do with, for example, different governing systems, whether it's a democracy, autocracy, theocracy, democratic, communist, socialist, and so forth, right? Memshal is the general sense of governance, an abstract term. Whereas memshala, the moment you add that hey at the end, it becomes a specific government, either of a state or under a specific leader. Okay, so two words not to be confused with another, as much as they sound similar. Memshal is the general governing system, aka governance, and memshala refers to a specific sworn-in government, not the government of, right, a specific governing government sworn in. Okay, some verbs before we get into how the system works. Okay. First, livchol. Livchol and lehatzbia. Both of these get translated in English as to vote. And it's both correct and incorrect. And we talk about this a lot with online translators, right? These will both get translated as to vote, but they mean two different things in their alternate or additional definitions. First off, the word livchol. Livchol means to choose. And this can be, I choose the color of paint on my walls, to I choose a name for my child, to vote. In fact, the word for elections, bechirot, comes from this same verb. Whereas the physical act of voting, when you go to vote on election day, where it's in Israel or anywhere around the world, is lehatzbia. Okay, if bechirot is the general elections, and we call election day in Hebrew yom bechirot, lehatzbia is the physical act of voting. And the word lehatzbia comes from the other meaning of it, which is to point a finger. Those of you who know the word for finger in Hebrew, etzba, it's the same root, lehatzbia. Because think of ancient times, particularly Greek democracy, right? Where your vote was tallied by who raised their hand, right? So it's the same idea here. That's where we get the word for to vote in Hebrew. So livchor, general sense of voting, latzbia, the actual physical act of voting. Okay. Another word that's important that you'll hear all the time in everyday Hebrew, especially if you are into interior design or you're building your own home, is lehalkiv. Lehalkiv means to assemble something together. This term in governance, right? We only hear in Hebrew usually when a new government is, or when there are elections and a party is tasked with forming a governing coalition, and they're tasked by the president of the state of Israel to leharkiv mimshala. Okay, they have to put together, assemble together various parties to form a governing coalition. Okay, we use this term, by the way, when you are assembling furniture or an appliance or even Legos, right? If you're using a model and you're trying to build something out of Legos, that is lehalkiv. So it's the same idea. You're using small pieces to build something bigger, lehalkiv. And finally, lemanot. Lemanot is to appoint. That could be in a government, that could be a diplomatic position, that could be in anything. That could also be in a business situation, by the way, lemanot, to appoint. Okay? And we'll talk about all those terms as they come up when we're going through these words. Why I'm bringing this up, first off, because this was a request topic, and we actually haven't done talking about Israeli politics in a while, but also this is an election year. We have yet to have the official date of Yom Bechirot here in Israel of election day, but it will be this year. And so you will be subject to a campaign. Campaign, just like in English, is a campaign, political campaign, particularly. And the word we often hear with it is ta'amula. Ta'amula means, in certain contexts, it does mean propaganda. And in Israeli electoral um, life, it means electoral ads, election ads, which are determined by a central committee of elections. There are very strict rules. When we get an actual election day date, we'll do a whole series on how to vote in Israel, what to expect, and including election ads and what to expect with those. Okay, but just know there are very specific rules coming to that. We'll get to those later in the year for sure. And just a review of voting in Israel is also very important. But just very quick, we vote here in Israel by kalpi. Kalpi is the word for both your polling station as well as the individual voting booth in the place. It's the physical voting booth, but it's also the location where you vote. You are assigned to a specific one. There is no absentee voting in Israel unless you are actively serving in the IDF or you are hospitalized, but there is no absentee voting from abroad. Unlike in other countries, you must be in Israel physically on election day to vote, and you are assigned a kalpi based on your address as listed in Misrad Apnim, in the Interior Ministry. That's why Interior Ministry, one of the many things it oversees is making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote has a kalpi assigned to them. Okay. Well, again, we'll talk about that as election day nears. The way you vote in Israel is that you take a petek, a note. Petek is a note of any kind, but it also means a ballot. Remember, in Israel, we vote with a slip of paper with the initials of the party that you're interested in voting. You slip it in a matafa, an envelope, and you are given that matafa after presenting the board, the election board, where your kalpi is, with your zihui. Zihui is identification. That could be your teudat zehut, your national ID, your reshayon nehiga, your driver's license, your dalkon, your passport, or if you're actively serving in the army, a teudat chogel. Okay. We'll talk again all about that as election day nears, but it's important to include, as is how election day works, and we'll talk about, because obviously that has to do with politics. Up until the day before election day, you will hear, even to this day, by the way, on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, you'll hear all about a sekel. Sekel is a poll of any kind, but specifically where people's voting inclinations are at the moment. These are taken on a regular basis. You can look these up in Hebrew, but this is the word for a poll, not a poll, P-O-L-E, P-O-L-L, right? A sekel asking people certain questions about their preferences and likes and dislikes and so forth. On election day, you'll get the midgam. Midgam, coming from the same root as dugma, example or sample, means the exit poll. Those of you who come from countries with exit polls, you know what that means. That it is the estimate results of based on people leaving their poll station and asking them who they voted for. Whether or not they were honest or not obviously affects that midgam, but is meant to be a general estimate of where the results will be. And then, of course, the actual results, the word for results in Hebrew, totzaot. Totzot emet are actual results, real results. Emet is truth. Totzot emet, results of truth, meaning the real-time results. Okay. Again, we'll talk about elections as they come up, but let's get to actual politics of Israel and how it works. In Israel, like other democracies, we have three branches of government. הרשות השופטת, הרשות המחוקקת, and הרשות המבצעת. הרשות השופטת, the judicial branch. Okay, I'm using the terms that are often heard, branch. Reshut does not mean branch. A lot of these terms are not going to be literal translation, folks, because that's just not how languages work. In the case of Israel, we use either the word reshut or ma'arechet. Reshut can mean authority, and ma'arechet means system. Both of these are used on a regular basis, not the term for branch. In English, we use the word branch, thinking of it like a tree. We don't use that term when we talk about the three branches of government in Hebrew. It's not that it's a similar model of three branches like other democracies. It's just not the word we use. And please don't ask me in the questions, well, Jay, could you say it? I'm telling you, no. We do not use the word for branch. We use the word reshut or marechet. Rashut HaShofetet, right? The judging authority, meaning the judicial branch. The authority, the section of government that's in charge of mishpat, of lishpot, of judging. Okay? Harashut HaShofetet. Just like Harashut HaMechokeket, and we'll get to this word mechokek in a little bit, the legislative branch, right? The one that's in charge of being mechokek, of creating laws. Okay, and harashut hamevatzaat, the executive branch. Levatzea means to undertake, to execute, to do. Not to execute as in capital punishment, but to undertake, to do. Right? So harashut hamevatzaat, the executive branch. Okay, three branches of government. This is how you say them in Hebrew. By the way, these are the same terms that are used in applying to other governing systems around the world. Right? We do not use, again, we don't use the word branch, literal branch off a tree to describe it as we do in English. Let's get to some important words, right? When we talk about politics, what is also at the heart of it that all three branches have to deal with, which are chok or chukim. Chok is singular, chukim are plural, right? When you see a word that ends with yud mem or vav taf, it's the plural of a word. In this case, chok, chukim. Chok is a law. Okay? Remember, folks, we're dealing only here in modern Hebrew. I know that there are other words in ancient and medieval Hebrew and in religious Hebrew. We're only talking about modern Hebrew and specifically the politics of the modern state of Israel. Okay? Chok and chukim are the words for laws. Okay? From the same root, we get the word chukah. Chukah is a constitution. Okay? You can talk about Chukat Artzot Habrit, the United States Constitution, or any other country that has a chukah. Remember, in Israel, we do not have a chukah. Instead, we have Chok Yesod, or Chukei Yesod, because it's a series of what we call basic laws. These are the basic laws from which all the other laws in Israel are derived. Okay? They work de facto like a constitution, but they are not quite the same thing. Why they're not? There are lots of great articles online in English and in other languages about that. From the same root, we also get the word chuki. Chuki means legal. If something is chuki, it's legal. Bilti chuki, illegal. And I'll be sure to add that before I send out this with you. Okay, chuki and bilti chuki. The person who helps makes the laws is a mechokek or mechokeket. Mechokek, masculine, mechokeket, feminine. Okay, and that's a legislator. Okay, the person who legislates. In our case here in Israel, that's a chaver or chavrat knesset, a member of Knesset. In other countries, it may be a congressman or congresswoman, or a senator, or whatever they're called. But in Hebrew, a mechokek or mechokeket. And finally, a hatzat chok. Hatzat chok, hatza'ah is a proposal. For example, me as a business owner, when I send out a hatzat mechir to a potential client, I'm sending them a price proposal. But a hatzat chok is a bill, right? A bill, those of you who are American and you know what Schoolhouse Rocks are, you know that song, I'm Just a Bill? That's a hatzat chok, literally a law proposal. It is not a law yet, it's a bill. It's something that's being pushed through legislation in order to become law. Hatzat chok. Let's talk about the people who you are either voting for or represent you, and we'll talk a little bit about the challenges of that as well in a little bit. First off, Nasi Medina. You do not vote directly for Nasi Medina. Nasi Medina is the president of the state of Israel. They are the head of the state of Israel, not the head of government. And we separate those two out. Nasi Medina is elected in by the members of Knesset. Okay, Nasi Medina, largely ceremonial, but has very important roles, especially when it comes to elections. And we'll talk about that as election day comes closer. Okay. And then Rosh or Roshat HaMemshala. This is the prime minister. This is the head of government, not the head of state, the head of government. Just like other countries that have a parliamentary democracy and have a prime minister, so too do we. This is the term that's used across governing systems in the world that have similar systems of parliamentary democracy. Rosh or Roshat Mimshala. Rosh, a masculine, a male prime minister. Roshat Mimshala, female prime minister. I put those in there specifically because we've had these. We have not yet had a female president of the state of Israel, although that would be a Nisiat HaMedina. But we have definitely had a Roshat HaMimshala, okay, a prime minister who was a woman. Still is a woman. Okay. A minister, meaning that they run a government ministry, is a sar or a sarah. Sar or sarah, excuse me. Sar or sarah. Okay, a minister. The Speaker of the Knesset typically comes from the governing coalition. They control what bills and the agenda of the Knesset plenary sessions and what gets put on the agenda, including bills, including proposal for laws, including all sorts of other things. It's a very important role. They're also in charge of the official state ceremony separating Memorial and Independence Days. So it comes with a lot of power, similar to the Speaker of the House or President of the Senate in other countries. In Hebrew, the way we say this is Yoshev or Yoshevet Rosh HaKnesset. Yoshev or Yoshevet, male, female, sitting, Rosh, head. Right? A Yoshev Rosh is a chairman or a chairwoman. Okay, it's the same term that we use, by the way, in business and in other sectors where you have a chairman or a chairwoman, Yoshev Rosh or Yoshevet Rosh, okay, of the Knesset. In English, you would say the Knesset speaker. We can also say Knesset's chairperson, but it really is the speaker of the Knesset. Okay, and that is their title. It's also abbreviated, just as you saw Rosh HaMimshala. We don't usually say the abbreviation of Rosh HaMimshala as that word. However, we do say for a chairman or a chairwoman, Yor or Yorit. Yor or Yorit. Okay. Just one second. Similar, within the Knesset, we have committees. right? We have the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have the Security Committee, we have the Committee for Advancing Women, we have the Education Committee, and so many others, right? And the person in charge of that is the Yoshev or Yoshevet Rosh. Again, that same term of chairperson. And a committee is a Va'ada. Okay, so just as we had Yoshev or Yoshevet Rosh HaKnesset, Yoshev or Yoshevet Rosh Va'ada of the committee. Okay. Under that, we have a Chaver or Chavrat Knesset. Chaver or Chavrat Knesset. Chaver, yes, means friend, but it can also mean a member of something. In this case, of the Knesset, right? And this term can also be abbreviated to Chak or Chakit. Chak, a male member of Knesset, Chakit, a female member of Knesset. And then finally, a faction chairman. We'll talk about what is a faction in just a second. But there is a Yoshev or Yoshevet Rosh Si'ah. Si'ah is a faction. Okay, what is a faction? Just a few words away from right now. Remember, in Israel, the Knesset is the Rashut HaMechokeket is the latest legislative branch from which we get the Rashut HaMevatzat, the executive branch. Okay, there is a significant blurring between these two. We'll talk about challenges in a little bit. And this is where the important terms come up of koalitia and oppositia. Are there Hebrew words? Absolutely. Are they used? Not so much. But we use koalitia and oppositia in the news when talking about Israeli politics in general. The koalitia is the governing coalition. Okay, it's the governing coalition, and the oppositia is the opposition. As opposed to perhaps other democratic systems, there are very specific obligations the coalition has to the opposition. The opposition has its own yol, its own chairman or chairwoman, okay, that is in charge of keeping the coalition, the opposition as united, because the whole idea of an opposition is to bring down the government and hopefully come into power as the coalitia, right? Coalitia is the governing coalition, the majority of seats, the oppositia, the minority opposed to the current government and or their policies. Okay. A miflaga is a political party. Very important when we're talking about the politics of Israel to upgrade our vocabulary. A miflaga is a political party, and it's specifically the political party that's looking to get into office. Okay, when we talk about who's elected into office, we use the word si'ah. This is very important because if you are watching procedures in the Knesset, you are not going to hear the word miflaga, you're going to hear the word si'ah. Because a miflaga, a political party, has hundreds and thousands of members and theoretically has a party list, and we'll talk about party list in a minute, of how many? 120, right? There are 120 seats in the Knesset. A party ideally wants to get all 120 seats. That has never happened in Israel, nor has any single party received the number of seats needed to get a majority, which is 120 divided by 2 plus 1, right? Basic democracy, folks. You need a minimum majority to have a governing coalition. In this case, 61 seats. If your party does not get 61 seats in the elections, and we'll talk about how that works in a couple minutes, you need to form a coalitia. A coalitia is of different siot, right? Of different factions, of different political parties that have been elected in. Once elections are held, right, the party is represented, the miflaga is represented in the Knesset if they pass the electoral threshold as a si'ah. So you talk about, for example, the governing coalition right now in the state of Israel is the majority party is Halikud, Mifleget Halikud, right? The Likud political party. But in the Knesset, it is not referred to as Mifleget Halikud. It's called Siat Halikud, the Likud faction, the elected part of the Likud party that is in government. Okay, important difference. Matzah. Matzah is not the thing we're going to eat in just over a month from now, and we're going to definitely talk about the other kind of matzah with the hey at the end. This is a matzah with an ayin at the end, pronounced very similarly in modern Hebrew. This is a platform, and specifically an ideological platform. Okay? When people are choosing who to vote for, they often look at the matzah. That includes the ideology, what they plan to do in their legislation, what they plan to promote, what they plan to not promote, and including their reshima. Reshima simply means a list. Okay, it just means a list. But when we talk about politics, and especially when we talk about party politics, the reshima is the list of candidates for a political party. Remember, in Israel on election day, and we'll talk about this again as election day comes, you vote for a party. You do not vote for a specific candidate. You vote for a party whose list of candidates is already predetermined by election day. Some parties, especially bigger parties, will submit a list of 120 candidates, hoping that all 120 will get in. Smaller parties will often have fewer people, right? Because they don't expect to get nearly that many based on their current size in Knesset or in general. Okay, but a reshima, when we talk about it in terms of politics, is who's on the slate, who's in the matzah, and going to represent that party as a si'ah. Okay? And finally, mandat. Mandat is simply the word mandate in English, but it's used in two different ways. First off, when we talk about election day and the totzuot emet, the real-time results, we talk about kama mandatim yesh lemiflaga. How many seats, literally how many mandates did a party get? Meaning how many seats in the 120 member Knesset did they get? And mandat is also the general term of the party that and the governing coalition that's given the mandate to govern by the president of the state of Israel. Okay, all important words. Let's get to some challenges, right? First off, like in other parliamentary democracies, there are ways to trigger early elections. And if you follow Israeli politics, you know we've had many early elections in the past several years. There are three ways in the Israeli political system to call early elections, as opposed to having it once every 4 years on a set date, like for example, in the United States, you can call for early elections, like in other parliamentary democracies, through three acts. One is called a hatzba'at imun. Remember that word lahatzbia, to physically vote? Hatzba'a is the verbal noun of lahatzbia. It's voting. Imun. Remember last week we had the word, for those of you who joined us for Cafe Oleh Conversations, remember we had a pa'am. And we talked about the word e or a often is used as an additive to a word to give it a little bit more flavor, a little bit more meaning. In this case, imun. Imun means confidence in this context. Hatzbat imun, a vote of no confidence. Like efshal, impossible. Imun, no confidence. Okay. If a simple majority, 61 votes, are received at a bill of no confidence, hatzbat imun, it automatically triggers new elections. Knesset is dissolved. New elections are held within 90 days. Okay? That's how it works. By the way, for a bill to be passed, there are two different ways for bills. Hatza'at, a hatza'at chok, a bill to be pushed through Knesset. It's either a private bill or through the government. It has several different paths it takes through committees and so forth, but generally it has to be passed by 3 readings on the Knesset floor. Okay. Again, we'll talk about that more towards elections, but I can also answer those questions at the top of the hour. So way number one, means number one of calling for new elections or early elections is a vote of no confidence that passes by a simple majority, at least 61 seats, 61 votes. Taksiva Medina. By law, the government has to pass a state budget at a certain period of time. There's a certain threshold after a new government is sworn in, and then every year since when they're in governance, if it is not passed in time and there is no state budget, early elections are immediately triggered. Okay, so that is way number 2. First is vote of no confidence. Second is the state budget is not passed through the Knesset. And the third is up to the Rosh HaMemshala themselves. The prime minister can resign, and that will automatically trigger early elections, meaning that the government has collapsed. Okay? Three ways in Israeli politics to call for new elections. Otherwise, they're held every 4 years. Now, we're going to talk more about this on Wednesday. And this, again, when I say we're talking about politics in a non-political way, I'm talking about the structure, looking at putting aside our ideology, ideologia, or a miflaga, which political party we look at. Can also look at the structure of things. What's similar, what's different to our own country of origin. Israel has some very unique parts of its governing system, one of which you probably don't know about and is a very important. I think all three of these are important, but you may not know about these in Israel, let alone in your own country of origin. First off is the term Hagbalat Kehuna. Hagbala comes from the word gvul. Gvul is a border, right? Any border, a state border, anything like that. Hagbala is to limit, right? To create a border. And kehuna does indeed come from Cohen, right? Cohen, one of the priests in Beit HaMikdash in the temple in Jerusalem. Kehuna is anything that has to do with power and holding a high office. So when we talk about Hagbalat Kehuna, we're talking about term limits. It's not a literal translation of term limits. We're not using a word for term, which is often cadencia. We are using about limiting. Lehagbil means to limit, right? To create a border. But kehuna is not necessarily a term, more as the scope of power someone has. So in Israel, there is no Hagbalat Kehuna. Okay? There is no Hagbalat Kehuna for elected officials. Members of Knesset, serving as a minister or prime minister, there is no Hagbalat Kehuna as opposed to other countries. Is that a challenge? Do you see that as good or bad for Israeli democracy? That's something we're going to talk about on Wednesday. Another thing we're going to talk about on Wednesday is what we have here, just like other parliamentary democracies, in Achuz Chasima. Achuz means percentage, and Chasima comes from the same root as lachsom, to block. A machsom is a checkpoint. This is what we call in political science the electoral threshold. Just like in other parliamentary democracies, you need to clear a threshold of a given percentage of the total vote in order to enter the legislative branch, the Knesset. In Israel's case, you need to get 3.25% of the total cast vote on election day, not the total number of eligible voters, the people who actually vote on election day, and the total number of votes cast. 3.25% is the cutoff. So all you do, right, you're going to multiply and make sure that you're up that 3.25%. Getting above that usually guarantees at least 4 seats of a party. Okay? And this is also what's used in the electoral polls that are done up until election day to determine how many estimated seats a party will get represented in the Knesset. Achuz Chasima has changed throughout the years. Some countries have very low ones, nearing 1%. Some have higher ones, closer to 5%, or somewhere in the middle, which has fluctuated over the years, by the way. And then finally, so one question when we think about Achuz Chasima is oftentimes it's discussed, does having a lower or higher electoral threshold guarantee a more stable government? Meaning, is it going to bring in smaller parties with smaller factions that you have to create a much more complicated coalitia? Or is it better to have bigger parties and potentially easier means of creating a coalitia? That's a question that's ongoing. We'll talk about that on Wednesday. And finally, one that a lot of people don't know about. I think this is personally very important. Myself coming from the District of Columbia in the United States, which many of you know is a federal district, 600,000 residents who do not have direct representation in the legislative branch. They have a representative, but a non-voting representative and no senator. Is that Israel is the only democracy in the world, and pay very attention to this, folks. Israel is the only democracy in the world that votes as one electoral district. If you don't know what an electoral district is, think about where you are from in the world. If you are from the United States, you have congressional districts, and you have a senator and senators who represent you on a state level. But you also have a congressman or a congresswoman who represents you on a congressional district, usually smaller. If you're from the UK, you have a member of parliament who represents a specific district in the UK, and so forth throughout the world. Okay. Most democratic countries, in fact, all the democratic countries in the world, with the exception of one, are split into electoral districts. The idea being that there is a direct correlation between someone who's elected on a national level to represent local interest or a specific set of people, thereby creating direct representation as well as accountability. Okay. That's this idea. Israel at the forefront when it was first being created, i.e. in 1948 and 1949, they were trying to figure out what kind of governments they were going to have and governing system. The idea of having multiple mechozot bechira was approached. It was thought about and then, of course, put to the side for all the usual reasons, usually security, wars, no small things, but it got pushed and pushed to the end. We are now at 10 million citizens who vote as one electoral district. And in theory, that sounds great, right? That means that all 120 members of Knesset are responsible to all 10 million people. In reality, we know that doesn't work. That's just not how it works. And we are the only democracy in the world that votes as such. We do have mechozot, by the way. A mechoz is a district, and it's usually used as a governing district. We have mechozot when it comes to the judicial system, harashut hashofetet. There are district courts that when you move up the judicial system in Israel, from a local court to a district court to the Supreme Court, right? We do have mechozot, and we have further subdivisions of those mechozot that we could, in fact, have direct representation. That is currently not the model of the Knesset. Is that good? Is that bad for Israeli democracy? One of the things we're going to talk about on Wednesday. Again, talking politics without talking politics. But it's an important thing to know whether you are planning to make aliyah, you've made aliyah, you didn't quite know how the system works. We vote as one electoral district. You do not have a direct representative in the Knesset. I'll make that even more explicit here. Even if you are a card-carrying member of a political party in Israel, and someone is voted in on that party's matzah platform based on where they are geographically, that does not mean that they have to answer the phone when you call. They may not even have office hours for you to be able to call. Is that a problem or not? We're going to talk about that on Wednesday. And finally, before I get to questions, because I see we have a bunch in the Q&A, what are we talking about here at the end of the day? Right? We are not talking about nihul, management, or a minahel, a boss. We're talking about manhig and manhiga and manhigim, leaders. Okay, a manhig, male leader, manhiga, female leader. We're talking about hanhaga, leadership as in a group of people, but we're also talking about the quality, the characteristic, the value of manhigut. And what does manhigut mean to you personally? What does manhigut mean in the Israeli context? Those are all big questions we're going to talk about on Wednesday as well. But important words you have, right? And separating what makes a leader different from a manager. Okay. Both are in positions of power, different things, right? And finally, a word we've talked about before, and we're going to talk about again, because it's a very important term to understand as it was built in Israeli society, starting with David Ben-Gurion, who coined this phrase, mamlachtiut. Mamlachtiut, yes, indeed, comes from the same root as the word melech and mamlacha, which can mean king and kingdom. But when we talk about in Israeli society and Israeli politics, mamlachtiut is the act of working across ideological differences for all of Israeli society. How do we bridge the gap between religious and secular, native-born and immigrant, Jew and non-Jew, male, female, all the differences that we have to create something common together? That was a term that was coined by David Ben-Gurion as mamlachtiut. Understanding that we may still vote as one electoral district, however functional or dysfunctional you may think that is, but we also have this notion of mamlachtiut, that for all the different miflagot, political parties, and siot, factions we have, and bechirot, and elections, and all the different opinions, We're still one country. How do we make that happen? Is this term mamlachtiut? Okay. With that, I'm going to pause here and answer some questions. So, like I said, first off, on Wednesday in Cafe Oleh Conversations, whether you've joined us in the past or not, I highly encourage you to come because we're going to talk about some of those challenges. We're going to talk about what you know and don't know about Israeli politics, what you would like to know, and how to put words to that in Hebrew. Because as you know, politics is probably Israel's most favorite pastime, its favorite sport. We're not going to talk politics, right? We're not going to get into specific topics. That's not the point here. Said giving you the words to talk about the system in general, what you think works, maybe what doesn't work, what could be better, what is your ideal vision, right? That's going to be Wednesday's conversation. Before I get to questions, first off, again, Toda Rabah, thank you all for joining. We are currently at just close to 320 participants. Once again, the world's largest regularly scheduled Hebrew class. Much and thanks to you. Next week, we are taking a break from Monday and Wednesday classes, and then we return in 2 weeks from today with our spring session starting at 7 p.m. Israel local time. I'm going to take some questions in the Q&A with the time we have left. Are you able to share a topic list for the spring session? Yes, we have a list coming up. We'll be sure to get that to you. But yes, we do have a list of classes. I would love if you could include tips on how to be a politically active Israeli citizen. I'm happy to put together some resources along with the vocabulary list we had. One word I did not include here is a shdula. Shdula is a lobby. You'll also hear the word lobby. And just like in other countries, we do have lobbies that lobby members of Knesset, both inside and outside Knesset, with various ideas. Um, that is a great topic. However, just like with a lot of things in Israel, it has to be in Hebrew. That is something that is not negotiable there. So there's only so much I can teach you without actually needing fluent Hebrew to undertake it. But I hear you. Okay. Okay. Insurance policy, great question. We don't use the word insurance mediniyut. You will hear the word mediniyut used for like the policy of this company is. However, an insurance policy, for example, if you're traveling abroad and you need to buy travel or health insurance, and we've covered this before in Cafe Olé, the word is polisa. Just taking the word policy and Hebraicizing it. So polisa is an insurance policy. What is the word for a pundit or political commentator? I will put that in our list. Let me open it up here as I'm doing this. Let me open up our list as I'm talking and answering this question. I'm going to put it up here. Actually, I'll put it down here. Okay. A parshan or a parshanit is a commentator, a pundit, some countries call it, and parshanut commentary, right? So many um, news agencies, especially television TV stations, will have a katav, a reporter, and a parshan, a commentator. Right. So if you watch the news, which started 49 minutes ago, because all the major news stations have 8 o'clock primetime news, they'll have someone reporting on the news, a katav, and someone commenting on the news, giving further insight. That's the parshan. As a new Israeli citizen, Aliyah in June 2024, how do I go about voting if I'm out of the country in the US? Like I said, there is no absentee voting in Israel. The only people who can vote absentee are if you're actively serving in the IDF or you are hospitalized within Israel. And if you are abroad, only if you are employed as a shaliach by the Jewish agency or in the diplomatic corps. There is no absentee voting. You have to come back here on election day. Oftentimes, many NGOs, and often in the case in the past, political parties will charter flights for Israelis living abroad to come back and vote, but you have to vote physically in Israel. Usually the cutoff is at least 6 months of residency in Israel if you're making aliyah. That we'll talk about as we get closer to an actual election day date. Okay. What is the Hebrew word for the postcard I'm sent that tells me where to vote, where they sometimes ask to see me at the polling place? So again, we'll talk about the technical aspects of election day, but that's called the Hoda'a lavocher, the announcement to the voter. Hoda'a is an announcement. Bocher is the person who votes. It used to be that you would be sent a postcard in the mail with all your details. That's also something you can now in the 21st century look up online. We'll talk about all of that as election day nears. Publicly funded or otherwise, can we expect this year to hear ads from all parties and or debate? We'll talk about how electioneering and campaign ads work as election day nears, but no, you won't necessarily hear from all political parties. Will any of it be available in English? Not in mainstream media, i.e. not on TV or on radio. Again, the official language of Israel is Hebrew, and that's what the vast majority of people speak. Some parties that are trying to reach out to specific groups will have multilingual support. So Arabic and Russian, because those are much bigger groups than English. But yes, some will have English, not all. Um, if you haven't already done so, could you explain the conflict between the judicial branch and the other branches? A big topic for sure. What I will say in this context is the following, without getting too much into it, because we have talked about the conflict between these three, just like there are conflicts in other countries between these three. In Israel, just like in other countries, the executive branch does not have to be made up of the legislative branch. And this is often a point of contention in Israel. In Israel, the law is that you can, and we have that word up here, lemanot, to appoint ministers who are not a member of Knesset. Okay. One of the many things that people don't know is you do not have to be a member of Knesset in order to be a minister. You do not have to be a chaver or chavrat Knesset in order to be a sar or a sarah. Okay, you don't. A prime minister can theoretically have their entire cabinet of ministers appointed from abroad, from outside the government. Some people may think that's smart, some people not. I'm actually going to add that to our list of questions for Wednesday. Other questions? Does Israel have an equivalent Bill of Rights? Like I said, the Chok Yesod, the what we call the Chok Yesod, the basic rights, plus the basic laws, excuse me, basic laws plus the Declaration of Independence form the de facto constitution of Israel. It is not a constitution in all the legalistic terms that that implies, but yes, contained within Chok Yesod are rules that pertain to individual liberties and rights. And you can look in English. Does Israel have statutes and administrative regulations once laws are passed? There is a whole very detailed way in which laws are passed in Israel. Again, they have to go through three readings on the Knesset plenary floor. They go through committees, whether they are a personal bill, meaning that it's a member of Knesset, or it's a governmental bill, the governing coalition pushes forward the bill. They have to go through committees and subcommittees. They have to be approved by the legal authority in the Knesset and in those committees to ensure that they abide by the existing laws of the state of Israel, that they're not in conflict with the existing laws, and if so, can they be changed or amenable to follow? Is there a word, is there a use of the word din in modern Hebrew? We use the word gzal din for a verdict, but din does not get used when we talk about legislation in the Knesset. Okay, the word is chok. Can you please tell us how to pronounce the abbreviations on the spreadsheet? Absolutely. Let me go through those again. Not all of these are pronounced, but I will go through these again. Rosh HaMemshala is not pronounced. You will hear some people try to say Raham, but that is not commonly used. For a Yoshev or Yoshevet Rosh, a chairperson, chairman, Yoshev Rosh, chairwoman, Yoshevet Rosh, Yor or Yorit. Yor for male, Yorit for female. Member of Knesset, Chak, they're a Chaver Knesset, a male member of Knesset, Chakit if they're a female member of Knesset. Okay. Ba, 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 bum. Are there rules for figuring out when an acronym isn't pronounced as a word? We've had a whole class on abbreviations and acronyms. Highly recommend. YouTube is there. We've talked about that before. Even though there is only one coalition at any time, can there be more than one opposition at the same time? Absolutely. If you look at the opposition right now, for example, in the state of Israel and for the last several decades, you will see there is the chairman or chairwoman of the opposition, which is usually a coalition of parties that are not in the governing coalition. And oftentimes that may or may not include the three parties that often represent the Arab sector. There are at least three parties at any given time that represent various parts of the 21% that makes up the Arab population. That doesn't mean all Arab citizens vote for those parties, but they are specifically voted in to represent the Arab sector. Do they or not? Another bigger question. But they don't necessarily vote or collaborate with the opposition in any given sense. Since they vote for a party, are there any such things as preliminaries, as primaries? At this stage in Israeli politics, only four parties have primaries. By law, Israel does not force political parties running for national office to stage primaries. Okay, you submit a list of candidates to the Central Board of Elections in a given deadline when elections are called for. And that party can decide its slate, its list of its reshima of potential members of Knesset, however they choose. Some will have primaries that are open to members of that political party that have their own rules of how you become a member. Some are, for example, the religious parties are voted in by the board of rabbis who sit at the head of that political party. Some are chosen by the leader of that party, the chairman or chairwoman. They all have different systems, but there is no enforced primaries. Okay. Some people, for example, will only choose to vote for a political party that has primaries because at least they're giving a semblance of something open and transparent. Because when it comes to election day, the party list is already set. That's a big difference from other democracies, for sure. Which parties allow members to vote for the party list? Great question. As of now, that is currently Likud, Avodah and Meretz, which are joining together under the banner Hademokratim. You will also see, by the way, political parties will run together on the same matzah, the same platform, but that doesn't mean that they're going to stay together in once they're elected. Okay, so it could be, for example, two parties like Avodah and Meretz from the center, left, join together, form one block that you can vote for with one petek, one vote on election day. And depending on how many people they get, that list will be a compilation of both parties. And once they're elected in, those two parties can decide whether to stick together or not. Okay? But currently, the four parties that have primaries, that is subject to change depending on what the political parties themselves decide, is Likud, Avodah, Meretz, and Atzionut Datit. Okay. How those primaries work, whether they're fair is a whole other conversation because they all have their own mechanisms of internal primary voting. Is mandat the word also used in mandatory Palestine? Yes, mandat means mandate. It's an English word. We just use it in other ways than just a mandate in other sense. It seems we do not have an alderman concept in Jerusalem. That is incorrect. We've done a whole other lesson on local governance in Israel. And local governance, you do have direct representation through your Muatzat Ir or Muatzat Iriyah, your city council. Please look on YouTube. We have a whole lesson on that. But you do have local representation in Israel, not national. Um, When Rabin was assassinated, was there already something written into laws what's supposed to happen in the Knesset and what was supposed to happen to the ruling coalition? So there is a ruling coalition, right? And there was a decision to have early elections, even though there is in governance in Israel a deputy prime minister, who usually their role is when the prime minister is away on official business or for whatever reason he needs to step aside. There's that. But then usually that deputy prime minister, in the event of, God forbid, an assassination, will call for early elections. Okay. Um, Israel does not have a representative government like in the US. How does an individual make the Knesset aware of a systemic issue that needs to be addressed? A very important question. A very important question we're going to talk a little bit more about on Wednesday, but a very important question. And by the way, that is a great example of a non-political question talking about Israeli politics, because that affects everyone regardless of your ideology. Is there a general rule for Roshei Tevot, meaning acronyms and abbreviations, that the two apostrophes that indicate that, which are between the second to last and last letters, are fixed in a position in the male gender with the feminine suffix being added at the end without affecting? There are no general rules, but yes, typically chak, chavel knesset. Chakit, we turn that abbreviation or acronym chak into its own word. So to feminize it, we add the ending a or it. In that case, it. So even though the word stands for Chavrat Knesset, we translate it as its own word, or we turn it into its own word, Chakit. It's much more vernacular than it is formal. Also very important. Is manhig related to driver? Absolutely. A driver in Hebrew is a nahag, right? When you scream at the bus driver to stop, you don't say atzol, you say nahag. That's how you get their attention to open the back door, for example, if they stopped at a station and they didn't open the door. Nahag, right? Nahag means to drive. Linhog means to drive. Nahag is a driver. Lahanhig is to lead, to cause something or someone to drive, to move forward. That's the idea of a leader in Hebrew. Okay. Um, If Israel does not have subnational districts like states or provinces, does that mean municipalities just take care of garbage, road repair, and all else local? And what about if you're in a super small community? Are they on their own? So if you remember last week's class, we talked about local governance in the context of Petah Tikva. We talked about the difference between a city and a local and a regional council. And we've had, again, classes on this when we talk about municipal elections and what a municipality on all those various levels is in charge of versus what the Knesset is in charge of. Highly recommend going over those lessons. But yes, the municipalities are in charge of things like garbage, like education, not the curriculum, but how to manage the educational system in a given city or municipality, how many schools, how many teachers, what topics they cover. Road repair is a topic often of repute of argument between the local and national governments. For example, when things don't go well, like for example, the building of the light rail here in Tel Aviv, local and national authorities like to blame one another for that because that's easy because where the line of demarcation and jurisdiction is a blurry one at times. Please add the Hebrew words for political supporter and political protester. You can look those up, but tomech is a supporter of anything, and a mafgin is a demonstrator. Also, by the way, demonstrating a product, but I'll include those. Is the word for a female minister pronounced the same way as the name Sarah? Great question. So Sarah is the Hebrew name Sarah. Sarah. Sarah, the emphasis on the last syllable, is a female minister. Sarah, Sarah. Sarah, the name, Sarah, female minister. Checks and balances between branches. Izunim are balances. Blamim are checks. Literally balances and breaks. Can you recommend an English book that explains Israel's government structure? I can warmly. And I know I often get in trouble for recommending this specific site, but they are genuinely good when it comes to this topic, is Wikipedia. Wikipedia has really good articles on Israel's political structure. Does Israel have anti-discrimination laws? Absolutely. What is a minister without portfolio? What is the Hebrew term? So the term is sar lelo tik. Sar, a minister, lelo, without. Tik is a file. But Just like portfolio means a file, so too does it mean here. Sar lelo tik. Israel, because of its governing structure and wanting to be sure that it can preserve a governing coalition, will offer its governing members, and this is left and right, by the way, in Israel's history, a whole slew of things. One of them is having a sar lelo tik, a minister without portfolio, meaning that they have ministerial roles and ministerial level of benefits that comes with certain pay grade, that comes with certain staffing and other things. They just don't have an actual mandate over a specific part of governance. Is it an overreach of politics and a use of money? We can talk about that on Wednesday for sure. Is the deputy prime minister from the same party? Not necessarily. It's from the same governing coalition, but it does not have to be from the same party. Some governments will have multiple deputy prime ministers in order to build that governing coalition. You need to think of a governing coalition, especially you, my fellow Americans. It's a big negotiation. You have multiple parties that agree that they don't like the opposition, but they don't necessarily agree with each other. How you keep them together is by giving them certain roles, certain budgets, certain obligations, certain mandates, some of which is the title of deputy prime minister. So if the prime minister needs to step away, this person is temporarily in charge. That's obviously a big role to have. And that's dependent on the prime minister making those decisions. Okay, with that, we are over time. Again, toda rabah, thank you all for joining. This lesson will be a recording up on YouTube in the next day or two, along with the spreadsheet you just saw. Wednesday, ahead of Wednesday, you're going to receive a list of conversation prompts that we're going to use in Wednesday in our breakout rooms, regardless of proficiency level. If you've never joined us before, highly recommend joining us, as a lot of you brought up really important topics to discuss about Israeli political system. Until then, toda rabah ve'litraot. Take care.